Hello, everybody, and welcome to Get Ready for the Answer. I'm going to answer all your recording, mixing, and music business questions, although we're going to zero in on compression questions today. I am Bobby Owsinski. I'm a producer, author, blogger, podcaster, and a bunch of other things. You might know me from some of my books. You might know me from my podcast. We're actually 11 years in now with over 550 episodes, actually 560. You might know me from my blogs, my Big Picture Music Production blog, and my Music 3.0 Music Industry blog. Or you might know me from my online courses. There's a number of them. If you haven't experienced them, I hope you do soon. Let's get on with it. There's a number of questions today, and they all relate to compression. They all come from this. This is my Awesome Mix workshop, and this was done in December, early December. There were 230 some questions, and I didn't get to nearly all of them, so I promised I would get to them, and here we are. Only today, I'm going to talk all about audio compression. So let's get to it. Here's the first one from Will. Can you explain why it's more important to place the compressor before the equalizer, not the other way around? This question comes up almost every time I do a Q&A. And for instance, I think I've been doing the Q&As 15 years, 16 years, something like that. And every single time this question comes up. So let me explain why this happens. I'm not saying it's the only way. It's the fastest way considering your mix. Okay, so if you were to put the EQ before the compressor, what would happen is if you boosted it 2K, for instance, all of a sudden what happens is the compressor sees 2K and it tries to tamp it down. So it's kind of going in the opposite direction of what you want. If you're boosting 2K and the compressor is working against it to pull it back down, then that's not really helping your cause very much. The other thing is the thing that we usually manipulate the most during a mix is the EQ. So we're constantly tweaking it because in order to fit everything in, we're going back and we're tweaking things so there's room, space in the mix for all the mix elements. And whenever you put one in, it means you have to go back around and do some tweaking. If you were to have the EQ first, every time you would tweak the EQ, you would also have to tweak the compressor as well. So if we put the compressor first, what ends up happening is everything goes a lot faster because we do our settings on the compressor and then we go to the EQ and we never have to rarely do we have to return the compressor. So this works really well, this method. The whole idea is we want mixes to go faster. We don't want them to go slower. The longer a mix takes, usually the more confusion you get because you're so far into it, you don't know where to go with it. So the faster we can get through things, the better, and this makes it faster. The other thing I should say, though, there is the exception. The exception is if you were cutting only on the EQ, then putting it before the compressor works just fine. It's when you boost that you have a problem. So if you're cutting only, then that works well, and people do that all the time. From Marcus, what's your take on Master Plan? Master Plan is a mastering compressor limiter. This is what it looks like, and it's fairly new. It only came out, I think, mid last year. It's really good. I quite like it a lot. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. One of the problems that we have with some mixes is we need to tweak a little of the highs and lows. You have an equalizer that will do that in this. Sometimes you want to tweak the width, and of course it's built in here. You can also listen to it listen the way the compression would sound on different playback elements, like it says NS10s and the phone, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is a really good one. There's a lot of very good mastering compressor limiters out there. This is one of them, and it's not too expensive. So yes, it's worth checking out. Thoughts on serial compression on vocals and the 2 bus? Serial compression is having two compressors, one right after the other, one feeding into the second one. But let's talk about what the two bus is, first of all. Two bus is the stereo bus or the master bus. They're all the same thing. This comes from the old analog days. In the analog days, each console manufacturer had its own nomenclature for the stereo bus. Some would call it a stereo bus. Some would call it a master bus. Some would call it the two-mix bus. Some would call it the two bus. It just means it's a stereo bus. It's a master bus. And just to clear that up, it's the same thing, only a different name. So serial compression. The reason why serial compression works is if we were trying to do a lot of compression on just a single compressor, let's say we felt it needed 10 dB of compression, and when we got to about 6 or 7, it would start to sound really bad. It wouldn't sound natural anymore. Well, then it's best to then divide it up into across two different compressors. So one is doing 5 dB and the other is doing 5 dB if you need that much. You might even want to do 3. So there's 3, 3, and 3, something like that. And then you'd hear it even less, but you'd be getting the job done. So that's serial compression, and it definitely does have a place. Mostly on a vocal, not so much on other things in the mix, but on a vocal for sure. That said, there may be other ways around a clip gain, for instance, automation, where we might not need that second compressor. But yes, it's been done. It's been used a lot. On a two bus, on the stereo bus, it's not uncommon to use several compressors and a limiter. For instance, I will always start with two separate compressors. One is the PSP vintage warmer, and the second one would be the good old SSL stereo bus compressor, 4K stereo bus compressor, which I love. So just think about this for a second. The PSP is on there for me because I like the sound of it, but I don't touch it. Just whatever the default setting is, I like what it does. But the meter is very, little indication. The SSL can do so many things and sound so different and really change the sound of the mix a lot. So you have to be diligent about how you do set it up. But that being said, it's a standard for a reason because it does make things sound good. So for me, the combination, really works. I'm not saying it would work for everybody, but it's not uncommon to use several compressors. Okay. How do you personally navigate compression and its individual parameters? I know it's a very wide question, but generally, from Aston, well, when you mean navigate compression, just think of it like this. There's only a few reasons why we would want to use compression to begin with. So it's not an automatic thing. Put it on. Does it need it or not? Well, the first thing is compression is for control. Control meaning you have a track where the level is all over the place. It's up and down. It's high, it's low. It's loud. It's soft. So we try to even it out with the compressor. Again, there are other ways to do this that we use in combination with the compressor, which would be clip gain and automation. But generally speaking, we're just trying to control a signal so it's solid. It stays pretty much the same throughout the song. That's one thing. The second thing would be color. And there are certain compressors that just add some color to a mix that sounds good. Color meaning changes the sound of it. Some sort of saturation, perhaps. A little bit of harmonic distortion, something like that. But we like the sound. Good example would be on guitars. There are certain compressors, LA3, for instance, or LA4 for me, that works really well in pushing the guitar up closer to you in the mix. The last thing a guitar needs is more compression, because a distorted guitar, because it's very compressed already. But again, if you needed to come forward and mix a little bit without adding EQ, this is a good way to do it. So those are the reasons why you'd add compression. And again, how you tweak it is how you set everything up is all contingent on what instrument you're using and the type of mix. So, your requirements, your setup requirements would be different all the time. Okay, from Jasper. How do you go about getting loudness in a mix? There's been a time-honored way that started with mastering engineers, and we go back to the late 50s, early 60s even. So long time. And basically what this is there's a compressor first, then a limiter at the end of the signal chain. The compressor boosts the level, gives us the gain that we need, and the limiter stops it from overloading. So most of the work is being done by the compressor, and the limiter is just cutting off the peaks so we don't have a lot of overload. If we do it the opposite way, limiters don't sound too good when they're really pushed hard, so that doesn't work. So that's why it's best if the compressor works harder than the limiter. But this combination is the way you get loud mixes. Again, it started with mastering engineers, and they used it. They were the only engineers that were kind of using this until we get to the digital domain, because there just wasn't enough compressors around and limiters, good limiters especially, in the analog domain. So mix engineers didn't do this so much until we got into the digital domain. So we're talking the last 25 years or so. And now this is a standard way of doing things. So on your mix bus, you have a compressor and it feeds into a limiter, and you set up in such a way, most of the gain, the loudness, is going to come from the compressor, and the limiter is just going to make sure there's no overloads. That's how you do it. By the way, I describe this more in just about every one of my courses. So, and I think also in the Mixing Engineer's Handbook, and certainly in the Mastering Engineer's Handbook. So you can read about it more in depth, or you can see it done and hear how it's done in my courses. Okay, from David, should I bypass Ozone when using the mixed balance meter method? Okay, what's the mixed balance meter method, first of all? If you should join one of my workshops, and I hope you do, I show you a method of setting up the balance in your mixes. A very quick method where you just use the meters. And you're actually using one meter, just the master bus meter. So, for instance, you'll set the kick drum, the peak of the kick drum to -5, and the peak of the snare drum to -5, and the vocal to around -10, the bass to around -10, and we go on and on and on. I give you a whole list. And that gets you in the ballpark really fast, and it really does work. So, that being said, the question is, if I have Ozone on the master bus, I assume it's the master bus David's talking about, can I still use this method? Yes, but. So here's the thing. If you're using Ozone, you may be using it in one of two ways. You may be using it for mastering. If that's the case, no, then you should bypass it. If you're using it to add compression, limiting, EQ on your mix bus, then you could probably leave it on. I wouldn't leave it on if there's EQ, but if there's compression and limiting, yes, you can. It works if you don't as well, but you can. I'm a firm believer, again, what we talked about before, trying to get through our mixes faster. I'm a firm believer that if you know that you're going to put a limiter compressor, for instance, on the mix bus, then you should put it on right in the beginning of the mix and mix into it. The reason being, if you try to add it later on in the mix, you have a really good balance, everything sounds good, and you're almost finished, and you put that stuff on, all of a sudden your balance is going to change. You have to go back and tweak again. So again, it's taking you more time, more unneeded time. So that's when it comes to Ozone, though. Most of the time it's used for mastering, and if that's the case, no, I'd bypass it. From William, in what situations would you use a multiband compressor? Multiband compressors aren't used as much anymore, primarily because now we use dynamic equalizers instead. They're still useful, though. So what's a multiband compressor? A multiband compressor, think of a graphic equalizer. So you see all the sliders and you move them up, and there's one band that moves up and down. Just think of a 5-channel graphic equalizer. Well, it's the same thing. A multiband compressor is the same thing. We divide the total frequency band into these 5 bands, usually 5, and there's a compressor in each one. So we can compress just this narrow area. One of the, I think, myths of using a multiband compressor is that you have to use all the bands. Usually that's not the case. Usually it's only 1 or 2 that you're using, that you're concentrating on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you're really restricted in those bands, which is why we like dynamic EQs, because a dynamic EQ, think of it now as a parametric equalizer, because now we can change the bandwidth. We can move the frequency. We're not just stuck on a center frequency. We can move it around and then add the compression as well. That's why we now tend to go more towards that, but they're still useful, multiband compressors. From Ryder, knowing that pushing compressors, particularly plugins, can create some distortion and other artifacts on your source. How might I mitigate it, particularly on something like a vocal where it's heavy-handed, but I want to preserve some clarity? Well, again, this is where, with compressors and limiters, the harder you push them, the worse they tend to sound. There are a few that you can push, GML, for instance, where you can push 15 dB through it and it'll still sound okay. But generally speaking, you get past like 6 or 8 dB, something like that, and you begin to hear it. It doesn't sound so good. So the best thing is, like we talked about a few slides back, serial compression. Just split it up into 2 compressors, each one working half as hard. And then it still gives you that cleanliness, transparency, and you still get the control that you need. Okay, from DB. What does it mean when someone says your mixes are too dynamic? Okay, so dynamic range basically means the softest, quietest song, section in the song to the loudest. And usually if the dynamic range is really, really wide, then we tend to lose the low parts, the quiet parts. We can't hear them. So that's why we tend to compress mixes. So now this dynamic range is actually coming down. It's less and less. And now there's no danger of not hearing that quiet part because it's louder. We've made it louder. When someone says it's too dynamic, it probably means that the dynamic range is too wide, so some of the quiet parts are too quiet. They're just losing them. So there's also the possibility of doing this too much, which happens more than it should. If we look back in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s even, the dynamic range of a hit song was usually in the 15, 16 dB range. In other words, it's the difference between the quietest and the loudest, between 15, 16, somewhere in there. Now we're looking between 9 and 12 for the most part, and that feels good to us. It's loud, but it still feels pretty good. When you get beyond that and you start to get into 6 and 3, and people tend not to like that and won't listen too long. The exception being there are some types of music where that actually works in your favor, and that would be electronic music, for instance, where there's not a lot of dynamic range to begin with, so this kind of works just fine with it. So there are always exceptions, and that's one that I can think of off the top of my head. So when someone's saying your mixes are too dynamic, it means that you have to compress it more. I hate to say that, I hate to use that phrase sometimes, but that's what has to happen. Okay, from DeAndre. How do you feel about parallel compressing vocals? Okay, so we talked about serial compression. Parallel compression is different. With parallel compression, we take our vocal track and we duplicate it. So now we have two vocal tracks. We only compress the second one, the duplicated one, but we compress it hard, maybe 10 dB. And then we start to bring the fader up, and just about the time we begin to hear it is when to stop. That's right. So now you get the best of both worlds. You get a fairly dynamic track that's still compressed, that you can still hear. This is a nice trick, and it works very well on certain musical elements. It's not particularly great on vocals. It's worth trying because it might work perfectly in your track, in your situation, your genre of music. Usually it doesn't work as well as if you just control the vocal well using clip gain automation compression. Tends to work better, and it tends to be what everybody does rather than using parallel compression, because you can play around with it a lot and not get what you need. Hope that helps. Okay, from Philip. Is it better to put SSL bus compressor release into auto setting versus a fast 0.1, that's 0.1 seconds release? Personally, I like the auto setting. What does auto mean? It's auto release. It looks at the program and then it decides what the release time should be. So it's figuring it out for you. That generally comes out to be pretty smooth sounding, and that's what you want. You don't want to hear the compressor breathe, meaning the level go up and down after it stops working. You can hear it, or after a vocal, for instance, stops. You can hear it breathe. So you don't want that. When you go to a very fast release time, like 0.1, you're going to hear it more, hear the compressor working more, and it might not be what you want. Now, there are certain types of music, again, electronic, sometimes this works okay, but most of the time it's too fast. So for me, it's auto setting. Again, every song is different. There may be some where that just works perfectly fine, but generally speaking, no. From Steve. I love this question. This might not seem like a compression question, but it really is, and that's why I put it in here. Is there a different approach needed to tame a Rickenbacker 12-string? It's very thin, has a real sharp attack when it dies off quickly. I can't get the fullness I want to get from it. The Byrds had it figured out, but I can't quite get it. Any tip on how to get it full and tame the pick attack, but keep it that jangly sound? Yeah, so this is just, that's the way a RIC 12 sounds, unless you do this. You have to compress it really hard. That's the real secret. How do the Byrds do it? Well, the 12 string was direct. There was no amplifier, but it was into two LA2As that were smashed. Smashed meaning lots of compression. That was the sound. And whenever you do something like that, you find you like the sound of this guitar, this 12 string, much better than if you don't do anything. There is a pedal that a lot of 12 string players like. It's called a jangle box. About $300 or so. And that sort of does the same thing. Pretty much nails it, actually. So that's worth checking out, a jangle box. And Rickenbacker actually made a Roger McGuinn signature model that had the compressor built in. I don't think they make them anymore, but if you can find one, you have that sound instantly. But it's easy enough. Just compress it and compress it hard. Judith. I'm curious about how you approach gain staging for a song with a lot of dynamics. For instance, if the vocals in the verse are very soft, but then kick back in during the chorus, how do you ensure that the softest parts don't get lost when you set the gain based on the loudest parts? Yeah, well, see, you go the opposite of setting, and he's talking about gain staging, but really this applies to compression, which is why I put it in here. First of all, the best way to set up a compressor is you go to the softest part of the song. If it's a vocal, let's say, or let's say it's a guitar part and it's playing loud and soft, loud and soft. You go to the softest part and you set it up so there's no compression. So then when it gets louder and louder, then the compression is kicking in such that the level stays the same pretty much. Now you don't want that to go, again, too much compression. So if all of a sudden you find that, gee, there's 10 dB difference and getting 10 dB compression, it sounds like crap. Then you go into clip gain and automation. Clip gain first. Just because something is soft doesn't mean it has to be that way or it's going to sound good that way. So there's nothing wrong with making it louder using clip gain or automation or anything like that when it needs to be, and just using the compression as a final little tweak on the end. This is what most of us do now during mixes. We use clip gain a lot to even things out, and that's what you do. From Federico, with what criteria do you set the threshold on a compressor? The threshold controls the amount of compression. So you're going to set it up according to the amount of compression that you need. Again, you can do it just the way we talked about, where you go to on that mix element where it's the quietest during a song, and you set it up so there's no compression. So then when something gets louder, then the level's the same. But again, keep in mind that sometimes you only need a few dB of compression. So a lot of us, you're using your ears, and you might look and see how much compression there is, and it might surprise you. It's less than you think. Now, there are exceptions, like everything. I worked in a media house once when I first moved to Los Angeles, and this media house did commercials, both television and radio commercials. And they had a rule that all voiceovers would get 6 dB of compression. So you'd always set it up so there's 6 dB of compression, and that gave it a radio sound. If it works, it works. Okay, from Gershon, under some settings, when I compress a bass, for example, and I want more control, I can hear the compression releasing after the transient. But then, where the waveform would naturally be dissipating a little, I can hear it getting louder, which sounds unnatural. Is that correct? No. So what's happening here is the release time is not set correctly. What we're trying to do is get the release time to breathe with the track. But that being said, you're always better off with longer release than shorter. So if you're going to air, you air on the side of making it longer. And what will happen here is, if you have a lot of compression and you're playing a bass, for instance, and you stop, all of a sudden you'll hear the compression come up, and you hear the noise come up afterwards, which you don't want. So what we're trying to do is make it so when the bass stops, then you don't hear that compression dissipating. Ideally, what we're trying to do is set it up, both the attack and release, so it breathes with the track. In other words, with the pulse of the song. We're trying to get the compression to go with the pulse of the song. Again, I go into this in detail in most of my online courses and also in the books. So it's worth checking out. On the online courses, you can see and hear how this is done. It's kind of abstract when I talk about it. But the best thing I can say here is just keep it in. If you're in doubt, leave the attack and release in default and just go from there. For Mikal, I'd like to ask you to address how best to use compression on the mix bus. Okay, we talked about this a little before. When we add compression on the mix bus, usually we're trying to make it louder. And why would we make it louder? Well, because there's songs that we listen to that we really like that are loud to begin with. And if our song plays next to them and it's not as loud, then people tend to think it doesn't sound as good. Yes, it really does work that way. So we have to get our levels to a competitive level, as they would call it. And compression helps us do that. And again, the ideal setup is a compressor into a limiter. So then you can get it relatively loud without having to worry about any overloads, which generally don't sound that good. So that's how you would do it. On the other hand, if you're using a mastering engineer, you can just send it to the mastering engineer and have him or her do it. Most people don't do that anymore. And the reason why is if you're doing a mix for somebody, for instance, and you don't use mix bus compression, and you give them the mix, let's just say, well, it doesn't matter whether it's a rough mix or the final mix, they're going to say to you, how come my song isn't as loud as Beyonce or whomever? And it's like, well, I guess I have to go back and make this louder, or else they're going to pull the project and go to somebody else. So that's the problem that we face. From Lorenzo, can you explain the New York City compression trick? Yes. I actually named this New York City compression. And it goes back to my first Mixing Engineer's Handbook edition. So I was interviewing all these engineers from all over the world. And all of the engineers from New York all used the same technique. Nobody else used it anywhere else that I talked to. What it was they used parallel compression on the drum bus. So in other words, they submixed the drums and then they parallel compressed it. And that gave it a sound, the New York sound, so to speak. So that's the first part of it. That's where everybody thinks it stops. It's not just parallel compression of the drum bus. New York City compression has two more steps to it. The first one is there's an EQ that's added to this parallel compression fader, and it's just a little bit of 100 and a little bit of 10K. Why? Because that's what they had back then. They had equalizers that's where they were centered on, so that's what they tended to use. And then sometimes, in order just to make the bass sound a little bigger, they'd also send it into this drum bus, this parallel compression bus. So in New York City is parallel compression of the drums, a little bit of EQ on the parallel compression, and adding some bass. You don't have to add the bass, but if you want it to sound a little bigger, that's a good way to do it. So this is the New York City compression trick. From Escala, what are all the precautions one should consider while working with parallel compression, like phase? How to overcome these issues? So when you're using a parallel compressor, you're taking a track and then you're duplicating it, and then you're adding compression. So if you're adding any kind of processing on this duplicated track, it takes a little time for that to actually happen, for it to process, and then add some phase. So what you have to do is go into your digital audio workstation. It might be in settings, it might be on the particular track, it might be on the session. It depends on the DAW you're using, and you have to set it up for phase compensation. There's something in there that will say phase compensation. So what it will do is it will make sure to move all the mix elements and it'll align them time-wise so that you don't have this problem. That's what you have to do. And again, it could be in settings, just overall in the DAW. It could be on a particular track, or it could be even on a session. So any of those. From Jordan, on my compressor, I don't have a knee knob. Is it because it's not a limiter plugin and a compressor? Should I use a different plugin? No, you don't have to. This isn't required at all. And what a knee is, a compression knee, it determines how fast the compressor turns on. So in other words, you're going to see a diagram and it's going to be like this. It's going to show you two lines and one is going to be like this. The other one's going to be like this. And what it means, and this is the knee right here where they meet. And it's going to be very, very gradual turning on. So it sounds good. We don't notice it. Or you can make it so as soon as the compressor turns on, it's there and we notice it. So it's a nice feature to have, but it's not on everyone. You don't need it. So I wouldn't go and buy a new plugin just for that. But it's nice to have. It's just an extra parameter. It gives you a little more control. From Arduino, when recording, is it okay to place a limiter at the beginning of all the tracks to keep any instrument from peaking or distortion? I believe that you should not be using any processing on recording unless you have lots and lots of experience. The reason why, if you do that, you can't take it off later. So it's much easier to wait until later and add any of that stuff, because you can always bypass it if you want. But if you record with it, it's stuck there. So I would say don't do it. Now, the exception might be, and again, if you've been recording for a long time and you know what this track is going to need, and you're positively sure that you're not going to change this later on. I know lots of engineers that do record with EQ, a little bit of EQ and compression, because they know that's what they're going to do later. But I would suggest, unless you have lots and lots of experience, not to do that. There are some engineers, myself included, that on a vocal might put a limiter on, but it's hardly working. It's just taking the peaks off a dB or two. That's it. From Klaus, when you recommend to use the limiter before a compressor, if the vocals have a lot of dynamics, how would you set the parameters of the limiter? I've used automation in increasing the volume of these parts. In which other situation would you use a limiter different than on the last plugin on a mix bus, on the master bus? Okay, so there's a classic combination for mixing vocals. It's an 1176 limiter and an LA2A compressor. The limiter takes care of the peaks and the compressor smooths everything out. You don't have to use this. You use it in a situation where there's a lot of dynamics in the track. The track is all over the place level-wise. So again, using two sometimes work better than using one, and using a limiter in this case, just control the peaks, tends to work really well. Should you use it first or second? I like it first. It doesn't mean you have to do that way. So, you can use it the other way and it will work as well. On the mix bus, it's different. You always put it last, but in this situation on a vocal, not necessarily. So again, you wouldn't use it if the level isn't all over the place. I mean, if the level is pretty wild, then this is a good method to tame it. And that's it. The next time we do this, it's going to be on production. All the questions that you've asked on production, there's a lot of them. There might be enough for 2 editions, actually. So with that, I will leave you with this over here. Let me go over here. So again, this is all from my Awesome Mix workshop in December. There's still 3 or 4 more of these that we're going to be doing, just to catch up with all those questions. But it seems like everybody likes these, so I'll keep on doing them from time to time. So send me your questions. That being said, I want to leave you with this. A lot of what we talked about here can be found in this particular crash course, Music Mixing Crash Course. I'm going to show you 3 techniques for balance, EQ, and compression that you'll be able to use right away in your next mix. And again, some of the things we talked about. So go to mixingcrashcourse.com to check it out. See you next time.